I'm happy to welcome you to join us for this wonderful event. We're happy for our guest, who Dr. Stone will introduce in a moment. But my task is just to welcome you, to remind you of who we are, and at least what we seek to do. The Center for Practical Theology is the sponsor for this event. And for those of you who are less familiar with the center is housed and part of the School of Theology here at the university. So we're a School of Theology within a university-based research institution. The Center for Practical Theology attempts to work on sustaining and deepening and expanding the relationships between the Boston University School of Theology and local congregations, denominational offices, religious centers, and how we might actually integrate our work to learn from one another. Various projects are before us, sometimes more than we can keep track of. Somebody in the church might be familiar with that problem. I know I am. Among the programs that we try to sustain and support include developing a network of pastoral partners in theological education, sustaining and developing research, congregational development, spiritual formation, homiletic theory, designs for theological forums in our community, to work across, help faculty work across disciplines, to support our doctoral students, our acclaimed doctoral students, the ones that we're proud of when they show up to our academy sessions, who actually wow our colleagues in the field with their interest and their research and their hard work. We offer fellowships to pastors teaching courses here at the school. We offer incentive grants for faculty to work on new courses and existing courses in dialogue with congregations and pastoral partners. We attempt to offer faculty funds and resources to help them with their research directly in practical theological orientation. And we try to support the School of Theology by offering support to the library and our library holdings in practical theology. These are an array of activities that are before us, and among those activities, as we try to support community forums, we also welcome your ideas and how we might help you in your work with practical theology in bridging the academy and congregations. It's integral and central to the work of the Center for Practical Theology. We have attempted to do it with programs like congregational research and development, programs like spiritual formation and church life, with programs like sustaining urban pastoral education, excellence, and new programs like homiletics, peer coaching. These are things that we're excited about, and we hope that it be contagious. So welcome to this event. We're excited about our guest lecturer. We're excited that you're here. We do want to acknowledge and thank a few persons. We'd like to acknowledge our assistant director and thank our assistant director and program coordinators, Reverend Charmaine Cook, and a couple of our program coordinators who have worked hard on this program. Holly I don't know where you're sitting, Holly. Holly in the back over here, Holly. And Soshi over here to my left. And lastly, but certainly not least, we also thank our Dean's Office for their support. And we'd like to acknowledge and thank Associate Dean John Berthrong and Assistant Dean Amani Newsom Kamara for joining us this evening and their support of this center, which is not a new support. We thank you for that ongoing support. Welcome.
Thank you, Dale, and let me also add my words of welcome and enthusiasm for this inaugural annual lecture. The Center for Practical Theology has been going on for some time now, but this is sort of a kickoff in some ways for us, even though we've been at it for a couple years. and before that called the Center for Congregational Research and Development. But having an inaugural lecture just feels like something new, so all the weight of the world is on you, Herr Heimbrock. Not really. I do want to also acknowledge and thank Robert Neville, who's here, who was the dean who helped us start this back then, and back when we were thinking about doing a grant when it came out for making connections, and he goes, well, what if you just did a Center for Practical Theology? And we began to scratch our heads, hey, what about that? And so really that was your idea. Let me also acknowledge and thank Dr. Linda Clark is here, retired now, a sacred music professor, but on whose shoulders we stand in terms of the legacy of practical theology here at the school. We're glad you were able to make it, and thank you for all that you've done for us. Now, let me introduce the speaker at this time, and we'll ask him to come up. Since 1990, Dr. Hans-Gunter Heimbrock has served as the professor of practical theology on the Protestant theological faculty at Goethe University at Frankfurt am Main. He is a member of the Scientific Society for Theology, the International Seminar on Religious Education and Values, the German Society for Pastoral Psychology, and the International Academy of Practical Theology, among, I'm sure, many other commitments. Since 2000, Professor Heimbrock has regularly served as the Erasmus Guest Professor at the Universities of Oslo, Stavanger, and Trondheim, Norway, and Lund, Sweden. His doctoral work, I just actually found this out last night, was originally in the area of theology and psychoanalysis. And he is the author of many monographs and articles, as well as an editor for over a dozen compilations. Along with Professor Wolfteich and me, he serves on the editorial board for the series Research in Contemporary Religion. And among his most recent publications, and I named just a few, are Religion, Immediate Experience and the Immediacy of Research, Introduction to Empirical Theology, and Religious Diversity and Education in Europe. This past year, in celebration of his 60th birthday, it's very hard for me to fix you at 60, but see, much younger than that. In this past year, in a celebration of his 60th birthday, a collection of essays was published in his honor entitled Lived Religion, Conceptual, Empirical, and Practical Theological Approaches, and we congratulate him on that publication. A copy of the volume is up here, and I'm going to steal it when the thing is over. So, Professor Heimbrock is especially known by us here at Boston University School of Theology for his collaborative and interdisciplinary work, not only in research and conferences and scholarly publications, but also in teaching. We have, for example, one of our own graduates, Reverend Dr. Gregory Thomas, who is doing a doctoral work under Professor Heimbrock there in the International PhD program. We should ask you to come forward and tell us the real story. But Herr Heimbrock asked me not to let you do it. Glad to see you here, by the way, and welcome, Gregory. So it is without further ado that we welcome Dr. Heimbrock to come and give the inaugural lecture for the Center for Practical Theology.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Newcomb, Dean Berthrong, distinguished faculty members, colleagues at the Center of Practical Theology, students and guests, dear friends. I feel highly honored, and after the introduction of Brian, double honored to be invited to this specific occasion and to present to you the first annual lecture within this newborn center. Yeah.
I can just move that right towards you.
Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation. I appreciate highly the possibility to share my vision on practical theology as empirical theology with you tonight. I hope that you will catch some of my bad English. I hope that we'll catch some of my ideas, despite the fact that I can't really look at the audience all the way, because I fear that I get blind due to the spot over there. My lecture contains 6 pieces and some concluding remarks. First, the introduction. Christian theology is devoted to reflection on religion, life, and faith. Moreover, it's a passionate intellectual participation and engagement in life. Theology and religious praxis are not identical, though interrelated. The matter of religion is interwoven with culture and everyday life, with the encounter of reality in general. The particular academic background and context of my presentation on empirical theology is the Protestant theological faculty at Goethe University, Frankfurt. The faculty's overall approach might be called liberal. Tillich's impulses still play an important role in several disciplines. In particular, this is true for the orientation towards a critical, constructive relation to culture as well as to theories of culture. The area of my teaching and research, practical theology and religious education, is embedded in, can best indicated by key terms like contextual theology or life world-oriented theology. Consequently, the phenomena of interest for empirical theology of that type are manifold. In Europe, within the frame of a post-Christian culture, we find widely varying interests in ordinary people concerning particular religious qualities of their experience in life. Some are highly interested to report almost any moment of their personal life in religious language. Others, although equally devoted and faithful in their everyday encounters, are not at all interested to distinguish or to qualify these events as being religious or non-religious. A German sociologist of religion illustrated this once with a nice anecdote. After the breakdown of the wall in Berlin, people on the street had been interviewed about their religious orientation. Due to suppressing of practicing religion during socialist times, many people in former Eastern Germany and also in Eastern Berlin never had any direct and authentic contact to Christian faith. A young lady, asked by the interviewer, grew up in Eastern Germany, expressed her irritation about the very question and answered, "No, I'm not particularly religious, I'm quite normal." Given the growing plurality of worldviews in late modern times, people are free and forced to make personal religious options, combining the traditional faith bodies with all sorts of new value systems, a situation Peter Berger called once the heretical imperative. And at least in Europe, a growing number of people refuses to make religious options altogether. As a result, they don't have access to what it means to participate in institutionally mediated religious experience any longer. Nevertheless, they are a highly interesting phenomenon to theologians. If this is about the actual situation, Christian theology, in its reflective task concerning religion, life, and faith, is not only about how to act and to react faithful to the situation, but first to engage in a deeper analysis about the understanding of the current situation with a theological interest. And this precisely is when practical theology comes in. So my second part about practical theology. Today I want to present the overall task as well as a particular profile of practical theology, focusing, as my title says, on practical theology as empirical theology. In Germany, practical theology is one of the 6 regular theological disciplines. It is an obligatory field to be chosen, especially by those students who prepare during a 5 to 6 full year studies in theology to become ministers. Already the title of my lecture might be highly irritating to many of you. Those who look for applied rules defining how to handle affairs tomorrow in their congregations might be disappointed not to find enough food to manage the daily routine of church life. Those who are at the university engaged in empirical social scientific analysis might be disappointed because I will not follow their paradigms of empiricism. And finally, at least some of those who estimate themselves as theologians might have serious doubts whether the program indicated with such a strange title as mine really can be more than an oxymoron. Theology in itself is normative, but not empirical, they would argue. However, these polls are most relevant to my perspective on the discipline because they indicate constituents of the reflective and engaged enterprise called practical theology. First, it has always been and is still essential for practical theology to relate to practice and religious life within congregations, though it does not simply affirm or double what's going on there. Second, practical theology makes use of scientific models, concepts, and methods developed to study religion in order to participate in academic research in general, though it has its own interest in relation to and in difference from social sciences. Third, practical theology participates in overall theological reflection on faith, culture, and life. However, it does so in a bottom-up way. It starts with praxis in order to confront the imperialism of idealistic constructs of a pure faith with reality and lived life. It does so in order to contribute to responsible praxis of religion in the midst of everyday life. Theology as an academic enterprise, especially in its Protestant traditions, stands for critical reflection on religion. It stresses the rational pole of Christian religious tradition themselves, and within the academy, theology, just as within any other discipline, just as systematic theologians regarding interdisciplinary studies in science and religion, just as exegetical studies with its neighboring historical disciplines, practical theology necessarily is obliged to communicate internal reflection on religion in a comprehensive way with other disciplines of the university. This might be nothing new for you. The internal organization of academic theology is a product of many factors: rational decisions, pragmatic calculations, as well as cultural trends, and especially in the place and in this occasion, as well as result of gifts. The set of areas of disciplines, chairs, and eventual research centers in theology we know is a contingent and quite recent setup. Given this contingent condition, if one considers the role of Scripture in Protestant traditions and does not reject the idea of academic theology in general, it's plausible without further explanation to have a discipline devoted to literary theory and hermeneutics of holy text, one of them called New Testament studies. Likewise, if there is within the denomination Sunday celebration of the gospel an important genre devoted to sermons on biblical text, in society based on knowledge, it is quite at hand to develop a body of knowledge about rhetoric, rules, and good performance for a speech in order to effectively prepare preaching. This and many other tasks are your job about homiletics. The same is for pastoral care and counseling, for Christian education, and some other branches. This, however, is not the case when it comes to practical theology as a whole discipline. Things are more complicated, and many argue about the necessity of a separate discipline. Time and again, two major objections occur. First, rigidly spoken, the notion of a practical theology seems to be an absurdity, a misleading term. It provokes the question whether there could also be a theoretical theology independent to a practical one. And if so, it follows the well-known advice that a practical theology should be done at a place exclusively reserved for practical clergy education, hardly within a university setting. And second, just for many of these, for people trained in pastoral counseling or in homiletics and working effectively in congregations, the use of specific field knowledge and wisdom about how to do things might be acceptable and even wishful. However, people ask, if there is any sense or necessity to devote hours, weeks, or even years of study besides this on an additional study area called practical theology. The very name practical theology, theologia practica, was initially used in the 13th century's scholastic theology, when for the first time there was a dispute about theology's general orientation. Should theology be a way to gain knowledge, or rather a way to obtain practical ability? In Latin terms at that time, it was about cognoscere or operare. In any case, this debate reflects the insight that in principle all theology is oriented towards practice. I will skip the next 800 years to give a preliminary picture of the outcome of a development throughout centuries. I stick with Edwin Farley's nice definition. In his excellent article on practical theology, he says, I quote him, "Practical theology is first a field of study in clergy education, covering the responsibilities and activities of the minister and usual, included preaching, liturgics, pastoral care, Christian church education and church policy and administration. Second, an area or discipline in clergy education whose subject matter is the life and activity of the church as it exists in the present. And third, an area or discipline of theology whose subject matter is Christian practice and which brings to bear theological criteria on contemporary situations and realms of individual and social actions." The three definitions indicate that practical theology is now being used in more than one sense. End quotation. Likewise, you find a sort of threefold description of doctoral studies in practical theology at Boston University, containing a comprehensive set of different goals and issues. I do not have to repeat what's on your website. My next part is about empirical theology. Today in almost every Western country, at least in the Western European, but as far as I know also in the North American countries, we find research centers devoted to empirical study of religion. Some connected to practical theological faculty, others working as part of social scientific research institutes. Most of you will be familiar to the Boston Project studying congregations. For Germany, I could mention a large number, only two examples. There is a Cologne Catholic initiative about studying religious participation and milieus called the Sinus Study, and a brand new Bertelsmann project monitoring religion 2008. Empirical interest within theology neither is an invention nor a sole property of practical theology. Empirical theology as an explicit and programmatic formula has been coined at the beginning of the 20th century in remarkable theological efforts on both sides of the Atlantic. This happened long before practical theology got its present form. One branch of empirical theology dates back to the early Chicago school at the beginning of the last century. A prominent representative, Douglas McIntosh, offered an elaborated approach in a study entitled Theology as an Empirical Science, 1990. Inspired by scientific ideals of English sensualist and empirist traditions of Locke and Mill, he was interested in the analysis of ordinary people's religious experience. Focusing on distinct variables of religious behavior, McIntosh tried to formulate veritable theological laws, as he called it. It comes down to an applied science form of empirical investigation that provides knowledge to be used in practice. However, at the very bottom of these applicable conceptualization lies a strong methodological concept. This is namely the idea to provide a consistent scientific categorical framework for the full range of religious experience. I presume addressing to American scholars of theology, there is little need to deepen in that. The second branch developed in Europe. The Estonian-German theologian Werner Grün was the first person in Europe coining the label Empirical Theology. Like Mackintosh, Gruen focused on personal religious experiences. Using psychological tools of empirical investigation, he was less guided by ideals of laws of science and more enthusiastic about the realistic turn of life in theology. As he put it in my translation, whoever once gained insight into the vivid life of this reality will understand why whole areas of theology are foreclosed to contemporary people and must remain foreclosed. He will understand that theology ought to be utterly closer to reality, utterly more focused and essentially concerning its questions and answers in order to become inevitable for human beings of today. End of quotation, and this dates back to 36, the last century. Empirical theology, as promoted by Gruen, followed an overall interest to bring life back to theory, to bridge the gap between theology and modern reality. I will not deepen in that further on. Looking back to his approach from the perspective of present discussions about methodology, it is obviously that the tools and aims of his program really were poor in terms of modern empirical scientific methodology. It might be interesting also to go beyond the explicit label of empirical theology and identify the empirical dimension of theology, which comes down to the awareness of the experiential dimension of faith and religion. Thank you. We will easily find numerous prominent witnesses throughout history, only to quote two. Speaking to you as a German theologian, I should not omit to refer to the famous dictum of the famous German Reformator Martin Luther, who once said at the table in quite such a situation might be, experience makes a theologian, and there is a whole program on that. In Methodist piety and theology, we find likewise, a century and a half afterwards, substantial references to experience as principle. If you take Wesley's theology, he elaborated a view on genuine faith which does not only consist of knowing and doing, but beyond these also in a particular form of orthopathie, which is a form of religious experience. Now, given my rather restricted knowledge in historical matters, let me jump to the 20th century and to practical theology as a discipline today. Despite the renewal of the discipline through the last 4 decades, only recently the program of explicitly labeled empirical theology developed as a prominent position. Forerunners were especially 2 colleagues, Hans van der Ven and his Dutch school on the one side, and the English group around Leslie Francis on the other side. The interest in experience and the contact of theology with lived life played a major role in reconstructing and promoting the discipline, both with practical and theoretical efforts. It is remarkable, one of the vital sources to renew theological education before this explicit program called Empirical Theology had been in closer connection to life and was provided by one of the founding fathers of modern pastoral care, Anton Boysen. He had a vision not only on pastoral care but on theology and theological education on the whole. Not only the classical hermeneutical path to understand traditional texts, but the interpretation of actual praxis of the Christian church and its ordinary subjects became his starting point as well as his aim. Boysen's programmatic formula was to read also contemporary individuals' emotional life as living human documents, which refers highly to the experiential pole. Not really much later, this line inspired the hermeneutic turn of the whole discipline of practical theology in this country. It found its most powerful and effective theoretical gestalt in Don Browning's model of practical theology. His outline of reflective tasks of the discipline drew heavily on European hermeneutic traditions, Gadamer and others, understanding Christian tradition and likewise understanding the actual situation, in his view, describes a necessary circular process in order to shape better praxis. And he was actually a genius identifying issues in religious practice of people and congregations as theoretical program. The aim of theological education, in his view, was phronesis, the habit of practical thinking, in order to act effectively as leader in religious bodies. It is remarkable and really important for my own thinking that next to the concepts of understanding and interpretation, Don Browning deepened on experience as an essential source for religious life. This twofold task of practical theology he developed refers explicitly to David Tracy's correlative model, which is about moving back and forth, to quote Tracy, between Christian texts and common human experience and language. And Don Browning tried to develop that a little bit further. He clearly emphasized the necessity to have a closer look at the focus of common human experience in the frame of Tracy. Consequently, Browning made an attempt for further and more detailed analysis. To quote him, "I propose we go one step further and differentiate common human experience into three poles or foci. First, interpretations of the practices, inner motivations, the socio-cultural history and individual agents. Second, interpretations of relevant institutional patterns and practices. And third, interpretations of the cultural and religious symbols that give meaning to individual and institutional action." Quote end. Concerning this issue in his fundamental practical theology, Don Browning again displayed his theoretical genius because he was able to combine the more continental-inspired hermeneutical approach with the American radical empiricism in line with William James and others. Based on ideas like pure experience of James, Don Browning opposed a restricted cultural linguistic approach to theology. The analysis of linguistic forms, in his view, does not give sufficient weight to understand the thickness of practice, as he coined that. And he emphasized the importance of experience as an independent source, not at all neglecting the importance of scriptural traditions for understanding of faith and culture. He stated, I quote, "Experience does things that break through the edges of our linguistic structures." Quote end. This hint deserves further reflection. Summing up the essence of this passage, one could say the empirical interest of theology refers in manifold ways and in numerous lines to the experiential pole, however, in different ways and based on different methodologies. It contained from the beginning a rather self-critical impulse toward theology itself and its loss of contact to reality. Reflective dealing with its objective in academic theology in all disciplines asked for conceptual clarification. Thus, the question is, what do we really mean in practical theology when we take religious experience as a focal issue for the theoretical analysis for empirical theology? What happens with the normative interest of theology? What type of experience had Don Browning in mind, pointing beyond the edges of linguistic structures? Why not take up the conceptual basis elaborated in empirical social scientific disciplines for theological research of the empirical? On the other hand, there is a most critical question to the overall idea of something like an empirical theology. Nobody less than Paul Tillich, one of the leading figures in the 20th century theology discourse, made a harsh objection against any methodological import of the empirical sciences into theology at all. In the midst of the last century, 47, he expressed a fundamental methodological critique towards the use of empirical research within theology. As he stated, I quote him, "It seems that the emphasis on the so-called empirical method in theology has not grown out of actual theological demands, but has been imposed on theology under the pressure of a methodical imperialism exercised by the patterns of natural sciences. This subjection of theology to a strange pattern has resulted in an undue extension of the concept empirical and the lack of a clear distinction between the different meanings of experience in the theological enterprise. Quote end. Half a century later, one could argue whether Tillich's reserve against the empirical does fit to current interdisciplinarity of all theological disciplines. Anyhow, it focuses again the necessity for empirical theology to qualify the concept of experience. If empirical theology wants to continue to promote theology, the necessity to develop and to make use of a concept of experience which fits to theological understanding of the issue is evident. My fourth part is about lived religion. If in my next step I will try to pick up those two criticisms just mentioned, to clarify the notion of experience and to be aware of Tillich's objection. However, I intend neither to simply follow social scientific methodology to the experiential, nor just agree with Tillich's refusal of this whole path. Rather, my approach to empirical theology is in line with the hermeneutic patterns of Tracy and Browning we just learned about. I belong to those who regard the study of lived religion as a particular proper research object of academic theology. In this very school at BU, I'm in quite good company regarding this choice. As the program description of my BU colleagues read, I quote them, the discipline of practical theology must be carried out in close relation to the mission of the church and lived religious experience. That is how faithful people live out their faith in social, political, and cultural settings. Quotation end. Thank you for that programmatic formula. To prevent misunderstandings, what follows now is not an encyclopedic description of practical theology in general and overall. Rather, it makes choices, focuses on the most adamant issue we continuously came up in our tour of empirical work within theology so far. I will depict a particular model of empirical theology drawing on a particular concept of experience. No questions, there are good reasons for practical theology to draw also on other objects, to study praxis of religious people, professional activities of preachers and counselors, the language of religious educators, organizational forms of congregations, and so on. Nevertheless, to me it seems reasonable to describe practical theology related particularly to the objective of lived religion, because this permeates all these practices just mentioned, and it cannot be reduced to other factors of professional practice. If my proposal is sound, it will implicitly be plausible why we need empirical theology and cannot just do with empirical research in sociology, psychology, or neuroscience related to the object of religion. Now, following Husserl's rule back to the things themselves, I'll continue describing a concrete phenomenon first, phenomenon of religious experience, and then in the next part draw some general lines of the model. In the Catholic diocese of the German city of Aachen, there was once organized an interesting exhibition titled, "What is Holy to Me?" They choose a very open approach, ask young people to react on this question in any way they would like to do, writing a comment, delivering a photo, or a personal piece of utmost concern. Thus, many youngsters reacted. Next to text, dropped many funny things: a teddy, a guitar, a tennis shoes, a cross, even a provocative statement, "There is nothing holy to me." On top of page 21 of this exhibition catalogue, which I have in my backpack, we find a short text by a youngster named Jürgen and a photo. The picture shows a stone and an empty slide. Many of the younger might even be not familiar to this technique any longer. The picture, anyhow, is not the most important point. There is a statement, a short comment, which says, 5 years ago, during holidays with friends, it came up to our mind certain things and events you simply cannot photograph. This piece of stone, depicted, is from a fjord in Norway. We internalized that particular moment intensely, and we never will forget that picture. That's his comment. What we get from this document obviously refers to an experience. And as Jürgen delivered it to the stimulus, what is holy to me, it indicates somehow a closer connection to what theoretical construction would call a religious experience. What the comment refers to, in which Jürgen denies to provide an explicit photographic representation of the experience, is evidently in itself an experience, and very well an intense experience. 2 German youngsters were on a hiking tour outdoors, perhaps during holidays, surrounded by high mountains and deep blue water of the fjords, and I know what I'm talking about because I'm constantly traveling to Norway on that, and they enjoyed the presence of the sight, but suddenly it was overwhelming to them, and they got aware of the uniqueness of the situation and this very point, certain moments you cannot photograph. From the short document, we do not get the experience itself, but only small bits of the person's description and articulation of it. However, they refer to an experience previous to the comments Jürgen dropped. The lines he put on paper might touch us because they clearly give witness of an intense personal encounter somewhere and sometime at the border of everyday life. We clearly see the occurrence is of special concern to the experiencing subject, otherwise Jürgen wouldn't have referred to it. Something unexpected and overwhelming happened with them encountering a particular situation, and in the midst of their life world outside, without any verbal stimulus, they made this spontaneous reaction with that aha about the mysterious structure of life you simply cannot photograph. Their reaction was mindful. What came up to their mind, to Jürgen's mind, is not an objective description, a fact out there he gives right definition about. It's rather a sort of confession he is deeply convinced of. It is a personal approach, a way to express himself creatively. He does not react in an artificial interview situation and does not simply repeat a pattern of learned religious knowledge he has been taught earlier. Nevertheless, it is about an issue which scholars in theology and religious studies are most familiar with: the impossibility to objectify certain things within reality. So far, my short example. Let me now broaden the perspective and ask how to conceive this religious experience in structural terms. What sort of experience does this example refer to? And what would be an appropriate theoretical pattern? My next point, the concept of lived religion. Phenomenological analysis of the structure of everyday experience can help us to clarify the structure of experience mentioned in that particular concrete example. And the notion of lived experience will also serve as a theoretical basis to explain what I'm aiming at with the notion of lived religion. Some essential points, and I cut them short. One point is referring back to the world of experience in everyday life urges to ask back to the life world with all its self-evidences, contingencies, and pre-reflexive familiarities described by the late Husserlian theory. Life world constitutes the human subject's pre-scientific encounter with the world, thus emphasizing theoretically the relational aspect of experience. In the relational approach, the empirical basis is conceived as something given. It's not an invention of the subject, it's relating to something outside, beyond the perceiving individual. And this is the original meaning of the term data. Data means that what is given. And only accessible through sensual experience of a human subject being involved in the experiential process. Not the result of experience, rather the process of making, collecting, disclosing reality, encountering through experiences is in the center. Another point, in modern theory of science, there is a general agreement the empirical coincides with the appeal to sensual perception. Likewise, essential to the notion of lived experience is the foundation of experience in perception. However, we deal with a specific concept of perception. The primacy of perception, colleagues like the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty are talking about, is not a stimulus of a mechanistic body to the isolated Cartesian mind. Thus, specific human experience rooted in perception does not take place in an abstract or intellectualistic way, nor in a causal mechanistic way, but rather in a situated connection to a finite body subject of perception, which is living and perceiving the world in a specific spatial situation. Through one's body, one understands the other and becomes aware of things. Perceptions grounded in the body as meaningful gestures, as articulations, are like the subject to be understood through the body, even though these meaningful gestures occur in situations of daily life. Further on, experiencing is always experiencing a something intended in mind, however embodied in an embodied mind. Intentionality thus cannot be simply restricted to intellectual or cognitive intentions of a reasoning subject. The human particular corporal existence has an intentional structure in itself. In every single situation, human beings always live their bodies towards the world, as Merleau-Ponty says. Thus, considering lived human experience, one has to admit our bodily intentions already led us to a world constituted for us before we conceptually encounter it in cognition. Another point, it is a common phrase to say, I make an experience. The phenomenological analysis of experience sharpens our eyes and senses also for the reverse. Experiences sometimes are doing something with us. Think of the example of Jürgen. They are not always the results of previously and deliberately taken decisions to act. This emphasizes the perspective for those layers of reality where the subject is not active but more interactive, interwoven with reality, affected, touched, and sometimes even overwhelmed by things. There is a type of experience in human beings which goes beyond pure strategic activities. It includes something even inactive, more passive elements. Elements described by medical scholars in the midst of the 20th century, like Victor van Weizsäcker and the Dutch anthropologist Frederik Buitendijk, as pathic behavior. The notion of lived religion refers to a certain structural analysis of experience in general, in which the concept of lived experience is crucial. And this concept was first elaborated by the German 19th century philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey in his hermeneutic reflection, particularly in the hermeneutic reflection on the nature of poetry. To quote him on that particular point, a lived experience does not confront me as something perceived or represented. It is not given to me, but the reality of lived experience is there for me because I have a reflexive awareness of it, because I possesses it immediately as belonging to me in some sense. Only in thought does it become objective. End of quotation. It is worthwhile to note not only the substance of his access to the concept, but also a linguistic peculiarity. And this is truly intercultural. Dilthey's German original text uses only one word, Erlebnis. And it took me 5 years to get to know the way round for this frame we use now. The English translation coined the notion of lived experience for Dilthey's Erlebnis. And the current German expression of gelebte Religion, lived religion, simply refers to that detour via the English translation. It's really funny, so I'm happy to share that with you as well. Recent continental hermeneutic philosophy of religion picked up this line of philosophy of life, Dilthey, James, Husserl and others, and gave a profound analysis of the structure of religious experience. There is no place here to deal with this, the internal philosophical differences between this line and the phenomenology. I refer only at the moment to some essential points, elaborating further on the concept of experience I refer to. In order to understand the very type of religious experience connected to the life world perspective, this is the first essential point, it is most reasonable to reconstruct religious experience as a prominent model and case of specific human experience in general. No serious theoretical attempt to deal with religious experience can ignore the difference between the unreflected life world perspective and the theoretical detached reflection. I remind you of my second sentence about the difference between theology and faith praxis. However, experience grasped as matter related to the fullness of human existence can be adequately represented in the theoretical sphere only if the description does right to the actual first-person perspective. And this is especially relevant when it comes to religious matters. A sufficient description of experience thus must take care of the subjective meaning with a particular experience, which a particular experience has for the experiencing subject as subject. Theory must not omit the point that the phenomenon to be explained does only come up by way of the subjective meaning-giving activity. To have a concrete idea of this principle, think of Jürgen's giving meaning to the experience. This is not the same as automatically sharing the experience of another person or endorsing the individual's meaning of the experience. However, to frame it that way might be misleading. Neither does non-interpreted religious data exist in this concept of religious experience, nor is the splitting between internal perspective and external explanation exhaustive to talk about religious experience in a human sense. Is theoretically legitimate in a form which relates to the internal relation between subjective experiences and the meaningful religious traditions. Lived experience might not be split up into a primary mechanistic experience and a secondary interpretation. The interpretation is to be conceived as creative act of the subject using personal and cultural symbols to articulate the inner experiences. And this articulation is part of the experience because it shapes that what is experience. It is not a secondary step after the experience. This crucial point of articulation historically refers to Dilthey's triadic description of the experience in the terms of Erlebnis, Ausdruck, Verstehen. Articulation as the integrative element of experience has been recently elaborated by many scholars outside the field of theology. Think of Taylor, of Joas, and others. It bridges creative personal meanings of an individual experience with collective experiences of symbolic meanings. Thus, to express one's experience for a subject human being, him or herself, there is more at stake than using collective language patterns for labeling inner experiences. If we remember the experience of Jürgen, this point gets evidence. No doubt, other types of investigating religious behavior of people are existing, are legitimate on other epistemological grounds, and lead to important insight and factors. The Science and Religion program in this school is one prominent example for another way. This approach might also be most useful for decision-making on church affairs. However, as it comes to religious experience, theoretical models which take the phenomenon at stake as objectivation and as separate objects of empirical reflection are defective, at least in this point, that they do not sufficiently take care of the life world-rooted meaning-giving, so the first-person perspective. It would be an intolerable reduction of human experience following conventional ideals of objectivity by way of theoretical explanation to filter the meaning perspective out of a subject's interpretation of reality. The perspective for me of lived experience would be extinguished in favor of an objectivist perspective. In the perspective of natural or social science, it makes sense to look for objective knowledge. However, some objectives are not simply to be objectified. Among other issues, human experience cannot be transformed adequately in a theory by a view from nowhere, as Nagel framed that. These insights shed new light on the issue of normativity, I think. And now I'm aiming at a structural reflection, not at a material narrative content. This is a most important distinction. The common alternative between empirical or normative on that structural reflection is inappropriate, because both the objectivist neutral concept of experience as well as the concept of living experience are highly normative. Might it be the exclusion of the subject's involvement on the one side, and might it be the most emphatic stress of the personal relation on the other side? So life world analysis helps to clarify the genesis of norms beyond and underneath deliberate assensus to abstract propositions. My last part about experience and the objectives of practical theology. Practical theology has a strategic task to describe and reflect on religious praxis and to enable better praxis in accordance with the gospel, might it be immediate faith, committed praxis in general, or the specific praxis of professionals. What does the theoretical reflection on the structure of lived religious experience yield for a model of practical theology? What type of theory does practical theology focusing on this experience just explained consist of? And what concrete issues will be analyzed? As to the latter, in recent years at Frankfurt faculty, a number of particular research projects have been done. The books on the table, for those who can read German, the red one will show a whole chapter indicating these particular projects, and the green book to the left at least indicate with some articles some of these projects. It is my conviction that empirical theology following lived religion includes an enlargement of both the material objects as well as the formal object of theological research. As to the formal objective of practical theology, I would like to indicate the surplus of this approach based on lived religious experience with 3 points. First, broadening the concept of religion. Taking up the phenomenological impulse does open our eyes as theological investigators into religious behavior outside the realm of explicit religious behavior. The example of Jürgen is unique. Nevertheless, it is an example for a type of religious experience in which people in everyday life, outside the rituals, outside the boundaries of a particular religious tradition, are engaged in religious experiences. Theology which picks up this life world perspective does not restrict its perspective to belief and faith tradition, not even to religious objects, although by no means it neglects them. Rather, it opens up its perspective towards an analysis of the culturally shaped forms and symbolic representations of life, to the overall questions how people are related to reality in the experiential pre-givenness of their concrete life world. This enables empirical theologians to study and to reconstruct the pre-reflexive and pre-theoretical involvement of human beings with everyday life and culture. Likewise, the concept helps to reinterpret those strata of religious praxis which are undoubtedly part of corporate practice of faith groups, prayer, meditation, taking part in service, and so on. It helps us to avoid a particular Protestant shortcut in conceiving religion and religious praxis referring only to text. And might be this is a particular German fault. The notion of articulation implies the idea that human religious praxis basically consists of a wide range of individuals and collective patterns to express the individual's experiences meaningful. Within symbolic forms, however, our verbal instruments are only covering a bit of this wide range. To repeat, Don Browning, experience does things that break through the edges of our linguistic structures. Second, understanding the structure of human behavior theologically. Lived experience, taken as a fundamental category for practical theology, gives way to a refreshed understanding of human behavior. Whereas in Cartesian tradition, human action, including religious praxis, is usually conceived as being intended by an independent subject and directed voluntarily towards an object, lived religious experience, we get aware that we are intertwined with reality in a rather different way than Descartes thought. Some of these behaviors are going beyond active behavior, let's say in defining a frame of reference to attribute a religious meaning to objectives in reality in a transitive way. This alternative perspectives where we are intertwined with reality is about the pathic element I just referred to in the encounter of reality. And to put that again in Tillich's words, the presupposition of theology is that there is a special way in which reality imposes itself on us. Quotation end. This mood of encountering reality is not restricted to any segment of culture labeled in linguistic conventions as a religious or a Christian practice. However, related phenomena are important anthropological and analogies to the theological interpretation of life from God's passion in Christ. The awareness of the human being interwoven with active and reactive structure of life, with otherness, could serve to promote understanding of reality in accordance with the dynamic and mysterious structure of life in theological interpretation inspired by the theology of the cross. Third point, emphasizing methodology. And this is now a shortcut of a whole chapter, which would exceed this lecture decisively. Decisive for any theological research is the clarification of methods in terms of general scientific standards. This is also vital for practical theology if it shows the capacity to carry out research on sound methodological ground and to instruct researchers about what they really should do when they go into the field. Like in any other empirical research, one can identify characteristic and undeniable research activities and more habits if the approach really might be called life-world-oriented. In modern theology, there is no discipline which claims to use methods which are single to theology, which are labeled religious methods. That would be ridiculous. This, however, does not exclude a particular interest of knowledge, as Habermas called it. Neither does it exclude to discern a particular theological research interest, as we have been told long before Habermas by Schleiermacher. The overall theoretical interest of theology, following from the analysis of religious experience, is directed towards a view of humankind seen as an interactive subject engaged in living relations, in living meaningful relations, in utmost meaningful relations. Opposite to a positivist ideal form of objectivity, this interest put an emphasis on the concern for human beings as experiencing and knowing subjects. If the tasks of Christians is to take part in God's ongoing creation of the world, empirical theology contributes some intellectual tools to take part in this process. Again, of course, this is highly normative. To be clear about the intentions of this type of empirical theology I introduced to you today, the pretension is not to develop a better or a more effective methodology compared to others developed in social sciences. It can hardly contribute to the analysis of detached data or to the measurement of large-scale correlations. Rather, it claims to enlarge the perspective of empirical theology by drawing on overlooked phenomena and by applying the relational concept of experience in order to understand and not to explain. Using the approach of lived experience, it is able to address questions, and thus this type of theology follows other intentions in the analysis of experience with a particular focus on elements and dimensions of the experiential side of reality. Ladies and gentlemen, reaching the end of my lecture, let me conclude with three general remarks. The first will be the benefit from empirical theology to a school of theology in general might be to keep up reflected contact with religious life in congregations and in culture. Christians are participating. It inspires a theological education and sharpens our eyes to have a closer look at the most familiar experiences, perceiving them with fresh eyes. Second, practical theology, focusing particularly on lived experience, helps theology in general to exhibit its indispensable role within the academy in general. In times when life sciences are scoring very high, there is, in my view, extra need to communicate the surplus of theology and theological theory to the interpretation of human life. Our epistemological reasoning provides secular arguments, and I emphasize secular arguments, to be communicated in quite secular discourses to enlarge an understanding of life and reality beyond restricted ideals of natural scientific objectivity. Third, empirical theology contributes to the coherence of the discipline of practical theology. Deepening into the nature of religious and human experience at best does not lead to a secondary body of knowledge separate and independent to homiletics, congregational studies, pastoral care, and so on. It rather reflects on basic processes and organizing concepts for praxis like experience, reality, language, action, and so forth, and so on, which explicitly or implicitly are used wherever theology is engaged in understanding and guiding Christian religious praxis. Dear colleagues, distinguished audience, I would like at the end of my speech to express my good wishes to the further progress of your new Center for Practical Theology at BU. You took the courage to a new research initiative which certainly will contribute to enlarge and to provide for the exceptional profile among the US-American institutions. Looking at this initiative from the perspective of a guest and colleague from Europe, I welcome your center and the underlying program. Frankly spoken, I'm a little bit jealous because you were the first to do it, and not us. Anyhow, we are grateful, and now I'm speaking as a theologian from Germany, we are grateful to you because you did it, and we also certainly will profit from it. Your new institution will help to strengthen practical theology in the international scene anyhow. Thank you for your patience. Thank you so much.